And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again. And I'm delighted to have a journalist, a commentator, someone who's been on my radar for quite a while and has taken over the reins in the last couple of months as the CEO of the David Horowitz Freedom Center after David Horowitz's passing back in April. And that is Daniel Greenfield. Daniel, I'm honored to have you join us. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's my honor to be on Hearts of Oak. I followed you for quite some time, and I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, great. And you cover so much. It was fun actually looking at your bio on the website. So the scope of my writings covers everything from domestic American politics to creeping Islamism in Scotland and how foreign aid makes its way in the hands of terrorists, it to white Aborigines in Australia, Islamist imams in Libya, flogging in the Maldives, and the hunt for witches in the Muslim world. And I think that kind of shows that this issue of Islam and the clashes in many countries is not just in a single country, but all across the board. And you've been putting a lot recently about that. So we'll delve into that. But obviously, people can find you. SultanKnish, there is your handle on X, on Twitter. Make sure you're following Daniel. Certainly for the UK audience that may not be as familiar with you, Daniel, I know you're very well known to our US audience. But maybe I can jump in. I was intrigued by some of the posts you put up on the UK. We are having many different crises in the UK. You could pick one and talk for an hour on each of them, but it's this. Maybe the first thing politically is the appointment of an individual, Shabana Mahmood, and she is the Home Secretary in the UK, just been appointed by Keir Starmer, the most awful Prime Minister the UK have had for decades and decades. And she'll be in charge of matters that concern law enforcement, national security and counter-terrorism, immigration and border security, and oversight of the security service. And she obviously caught your eye, her appointment. Maybe you can give us your thoughts as a US citizen looking over to the UK at the political scene.
I was following her career for a bit. I was noting her work in what one might call euphemistically justice, back when there were protests against the horrifying Southport stabbings, and her vicious, really, eagerness to lock up anyone protesting against it, of course, in sharp contrast to the various other protests that are considered legitimate, like, say, coming out for Hamas. So this is obviously a determination by the government that they were going to double down on everything that they've been doing, which is treating the people who are pointing out the crisis as the problem, as the enemy, as people who need to be locked up, and at the same time continuing to provide a pass for the mass invasion, the Islamic invasion across the channel. No, I believe 1,000 people, 1,000 invaders arrived on her first day on the job. And they now have someone taking point on counterterrorism who is tied to the Muslim Council of Britain, which is an organization in the past had justified Al Qaeda, whose top leader had actually defended and justified Hamas. And she met with Sir Mark Rowley, and her takeaway was that, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but supporting a prescribed terrorist organization is not the same thing as supporting the Palestinian people, which is, of course, to say that she's laundering support for terrorism. And terrorism is not a unitary thing. It's the people who are supporting terrorism in Israel are also going to support it in the UK. They're going to support it in the US. They're going to support it in India. To them, it is very much a global situation. We have this false distinction in which we just support the resistance in Iraq. We just support the resistance in Palestine. We just support the resistance in Kashmir. No, these people support the so-called resistance, by which they mean Islamic Jihad, the Islamic conquest of non-Muslims. They support it everywhere. They're trying to divide and conquer us.
No, they are. And just as a sidestep, behind you is your book, Domestic Enemies, The Founding Fathers Fight Against the Left, published kind of just before last summer. So just flagging that up. The links are all in the description. But it must, I mean, it must concern you as an American, and you put up a concern of intelligence sharing, because the UK and US have traditionally been part of the Five Eyes, but also traditionally have been fairly close in terms of collaboration, in terms of sharing information. Um, what does this mean in terms of the US sharing information with the UK?
It's a drastic compromise of integrity and national security. Even with limited Islamist staffers making their way into governments in Europe and America. During the previous administration, we had staffers who were Muslim actually leak information specifically over Islamic issues, like those involving Israel. And those people were staffers. In this case, you have somebody at the top of the food chain who now is in a position to abuse classified information in all sorts of ways, with a government that has made it very clear that they are going to back her up to the hilt. This is very seriously concerning, especially at a time when the United States is looking at possible conflicts around the world, when there are terrorist plots that are going to be potentially engineered. Certainly, we have domestic plots in both nations, and we have the potential for international plots. The withdrawal from Afghanistan has created a situation where Al-Qaeda has been able to rebuild there. They've been setting up bases on a large scale. They're now going to profit from a lot of money and aid after Afghanistan's earthquake that is going to come in, because all that money goes into the hands of the terrorists. So they're going to be in a position to once again go back to pre-9/11, go back to thinking about international terrorist plots, because they have a safe base to operate from. And at this point, both the United States and the UK have been severely compromised in the past, and the situation in the UK is far graver. With an ally, a political ally of people who once defended Al Qaeda, who once rejected a ban on Al Qaeda because they claim that some people have a right to resist. So this is a very grave situation.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
And it's, both sides of the Atlantic were in a much worse situation. And I don't mean to compare the drastic situation we have in the UK with the US, but there have been some maybe intriguing political appointees. You had reposted something that Laura Loomer had put out, and I hadn't actually seen that the US Air Force had placed Shariful Khan in charge of the Golden Dome. And this is the Golden Dome, a fantastic idea from President Trump, but of course it depends who you put in charge of that. And surely it should be an American in charge of actually protecting US borders.
The push for diversity in the United States military, I've written quite about it. Some of these are not really visible on the screen, but this was one of the things I wrote about. It was about the infiltration of the military by the left, and one of it was a push for diversity. So even beyond Islam, which is a bad enough threat, we've had multiple cases of Chinese espionage in the U.S. military, because people were taken in who were fairly new immigrants, whose allegiances were to their home country, and they went ahead and they provided serious amounts of classified information. So this is a serious issue. And when you put any foreign national, and no, I mean, I'm an immigrant to the United States. I shouldn't be in a position where I have access to classified materials. It's just basic common sense, you know.
No,
And yeah, and I'm not it was not a national of a enemy nation, but nonetheless, you shouldn't do this. And we began doing this on a large scale because we, of course, wanted diversity above all else. White men were distrusted. We have bit of a video clip where Mahmood is actually saying that white men waving the English flag, they're bad people. So this was the attitude that so many radical leftist administrations, governments adopted, one which viewed white men as the enemy. That was the case under the Biden administration, the Obama administration. And so they were willing to bring in any foreign nationals. And this is the legacy. So we have a lot of people who are enemy nationals, whether it's Pakistan. Pakistan is absolutely an enemy nation that we have not classified as such. The People's Republic of China, we have these people in positions of national security, and we need to urgently clear them out.
When in the UK with Mahmood coming into that position, and she's been in government, she's been an MP since 2010, so 15 years. But after this Southport attack, which was those three girls that were murdered. The information was held from the UK. It ended up being a Muslim, a
Mhm.
convert to Islam that had carried out that attack. And she seemed to be more concerned of how Islam was treated to how these three girls actually were murdered. I mean, do you see kind of in the US also that disconnect of maybe allegiance?
Oh, absolutely. The first priority after every Islamic terrorist attack is the Islamophobic backlash, to the point that it become a joke. And the deceased, the late comedian Norm Macdonald actually clipped that, imagine a nuclear bomb goes off, think and kills millions of Americans. Imagine the impact on the Muslim community. Imagine the Islamophobic backlash. So it's long since been a joke. There's a Muslim terrorist who runs over people in New Orleans. They instantly pivot to the Muslim community fears Islamophobic backlash, and many of these backlashes we found have actually been fake. There was a time when I broke down a lot of those so-called attacks that were absolutely a hoax. They were a media lie. We've had a case where there were three shooting of three Muslim men in Vermont. And there was widespread claims across the media by politicians. Every top politician condemned it, claimed it was Islamophobia. The man himself the shooter turned out to be a nutter who himself actually supported Hamas, who was mentally ill, who had no way of seeing that they were Muslims. It was all a lie. And this went on for a month. So we have these actual backlashes, which may or may not exist. And we have ones that are very, very clearly fake. But the emphasis very much is on what is the impact of this Muslim terrorist attack on the Muslim community, not, what is the impact of thousands of girls being sexually assaulted or three little girls being stabbed to death. It's never what is the impact of this horrific crime on the crime victims. It's what is the impact of this crime on the co-religionist of the perpetrator, of the people who went to the same mosque as he did and reported nothing. And worse still, were members, took part in organizations like the Center for American Islamic Relations, a Muslim Brotherhood group in the United States, that actively tells Muslims not to cooperate with the FBI. And no questions are ever asked about this. Well, you're really taking part in events that actually urge you not to cooperate with the FBI. And you didn't cooperate with law enforcement. You didn't tell them about this man was plotting an attack. But no, they're the victim because of Islamophobia.
I mean, you mentioned Muslim Brotherhood, and I saw a tweet. I don't know if you've seen it, but just a tweet and then a letter from Nick Timothy, who is a conservative politician in the UK, and he had written to government concerns of a new organisation that actually had popped up in the UK with strong links to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, the UK seem to have a problem in parts of Europe. You've got European countries concerned about Muslim Brotherhood and maybe the influence they have in politics and in society. The UK don't seem to have any understanding. I don't know how you see that. If you see the UK as failing to understand and address this threat, or if you don't see it as a problem, I mean, how do you see it as an American, that failure, I think, by the UK government to address the Muslim Brotherhood?
It's a major crisis. The UK is probably Europe's biggest base for the Brotherhood. The United States has also become a base, and they were infected in fairly similar ways. The Muslim Brotherhood was originally a movement involving students in Egypt. Obviously, the UK had a presence in Egypt. They brought a bunch of these people back to get an education. For that matter, the United States under JFK began bringing people from the Muslim world in the hopes of influencing them positively and also to use them as cheap intellectual labor. So they wanted doctors, engineers cheaply, and they got them. But those people in Egypt and certain Muslim countries tended to be Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was very dominant. It was like the Communist Party in certain countries. So you wanted cheap engineers, you got them. You wanted cheap professors, you got them. Those people actually set up Brotherhood operations. And the Brotherhood, it's important to note, really modeled itself as functionally on some of the anarchist, the leftist, the secret societies in Europe in the 19th century or so. So they are very good at setting up different front groups, and they spin them off automatically. There are dozens in the United States by now. And when one is exposed, and if it actually suffers critical reputational damage, they set up a bunch more. If it doesn't, they still set up a bunch more. So when you have one of these Muslim Brotherhood or petitions or letters that they sign on some issue that they care about, well, you see a dozen organizations signed onto it. The organizations are all just different forms of the Brotherhood. This is something also that communist groups are very good at, and the Islamist groups imitated them.
What's the situation like in the US in terms of Muslim Brotherhood? Because I've talked to probably Frank Gaffney about this different times, and Robert Spencer, who've had on quite a number of times, and other people who I know you will know well in terms of ringing the alarm bells on the impact of Islam in the West. But in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, is there a desire and awareness and intelligence now to begin to push back on that, or is it an entity? It's not a single organization, but an entity that's managed to kind of subvert any intelligent insight by the U.S. government?
Unfortunately, the Obama administration went ahead and dismantled much of our counter-jihad capabilities. Worse still, they replaced it with a pro-jihad capability. The idea being a program at the time known as countering violent extremism, the idea being that we would recruit the good Islamists to oppose the bad Islamists, and then they would explain to the bad Islamists why they shouldn't go on and kill us, because really it's not the right thing to do. So, of course, by that point, it's been thoroughly corrupted. Even under the Bush administration, we had initial raids, initial proposals to we actually turned up significant information about the Brotherhood in those days. In the first year or so after September 11th, we found documentation on them. We actually have pretty much 90% of the evidence we have about the Brotherhood's operations come from that time. Unfortunately, it was all shut down. There has been talk about now actually outlawing the Brotherhood. There have been a number of senators. Senator Ted Cruz has proposed it. I think it is quite urgent, but there's been a good deal of opposition because it's important to understand Islamists are not politically on the left-right spectrum. A lot of people kind of associate them with the left. They found the left to be a very good home for them, but they are quite happy to go to the right as long as there's a place for them to infiltrate. So it is about infiltration. They don't actually care left or right. You see when politicians on the right say something, they agree with something that serves their interest, they're very happy to come out and support them. But their ultimate goal is Islamist parties. We've seen actually a number of polls in the UK where the younger population is strongly supportive of an actual Muslim party. We've seen the evolutionary beginnings of one. We're going to see that in the United States as well. But until they actually have the strength, the demographics to actually launch their own political parties in the United States, it may take quite a while for that to make sense to pull off. They're going to operate within the structure of those parties, but it's very much divide and conquer. If you look back at the history of Islam, they are very good at divide and conquer. You have the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. Those were the two great world powers of the day, and they very effectively pitted them against each other. They acted as mercenaries, and they brought them both down. So this is something Islam does very well. It pits us against each other, Jews against Christians, Christians against Hindus, atheists against Christians, people from various nationalities against each other. But in the process, of course, they mean for the triumph of only one side, Islam.
Can I ask you about the term Islamophobia? We in the UK, and you've posted about this, how Mahmood, the Home Secretary, has backed a new legal definition of Islamophobia. And of course, that would ban anyone from referencing anything negative about Muhammad, talking about Islamic history, the grooming gangs, etc., etc. And we at the moment we have got an all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, one of the many groupings made up of MPs in the UK Parliament, and it has a working group on this new definition of Islamophobia. And it seems to be a push towards an Islamic blasphemy law. And we haven't had a blasphemy legislation for a long time in the UK. I mean, how do you view that in terms of the collapse of free speech in the UK and the ability to critique Islam? But then what kind of has the US got to learn from that spread of censorship?
Oh, the thing about Islamophobia that makes it so unique is that normally hate crimes, crimes against other groups is don't punch members of that group in the face. That's pretty straightforward. With Islamophobia, it is really not focused on actual assaults and it's things that might be described as crimes, but narratives. The danger of Islamophobia, we are told, is associating Islam with terrorism, making any critical statements about Islam. Thus, the Islamophobia definition, for example, is interesting because it focuses on banning people from saying that Islam expanded by the sword, which is simple historical fact, that it represses minorities, simple fact of events that's going on around the world. Any suggestion that there's any that Muhammad might have had a thing for younger girls, of course, one must not mention that. That is a very serious offense. And in general, any kind of negative suggestion about Islamic narratives. It's really not, don't punch this Muslim person in the face. It's don't say anything negative about Islam. Certainly don't burn a Quran. You have people actually being arrested for burning a Quran, which is quite interesting because you can burn a Bible and that's perfectly fine. You can burn, if you get a copy of the Magna Carta or the Constitution, you can burn that. We've actually had people here try to vandalize copies of it. But of course, you cannot in any way deface a Quran because that is a hate crime. That's not actually a hate crime. That's a crime against a religion sensibility, which, there might be an argument for we should have protection for religious sensibilities, but that's not actually the case for other religions. So what you have is a two-tier system, one in which you cannot have any criticism of Islam. You cannot have any violation of the religious sensibilities of Islam. And Shabana Mahmood actually came out and endorsed backing that definition, the parliamentary definition of Islamophobia, one which, again, it effectively means creating a religious law for one particular religion in the UK. And of course, we are faced with the same players pushing that same position in the United States. So we've had actually a quite uniquely shameful event after the attack on the United States consulate in Libya and Benghazi, where Hillary Clinton told family members of the deceased that we're going to get the guy who made that video. By the video, she meant a man who made a YouTube video mocking Muhammad, which she and the government blamed for that. And we actually have a photo, it's one of the more shameful photos in American history, of California sheriff's deputies surrounding this man who made a YouTube video. And there's just a crowd of them, like a dozen of them, escorting him away because he made a YouTube video that offended Muslims. So there's been a partnership here. Islamic terrorism goes hand in hand with this push for regulating Islamophobia. And the Muslim terrorists, of course, know what they're doing. They engage in attacks. We scurry to appease them by arresting anybody who says anything at all about Islam.
This move in the UK fits with our hate speech legislations that we are trying to criminalize the emotion of hate. And it's intriguing when you look at not only in the UK, but parts of the rest of Europe as well. I mean, what was it, 10 days ago, someone was arrested for saying they love bacon in front of a mosque. That's how ludicrous this has become. And I think it's the case that the police no longer know how to enforce the legislation because it's so arbitrary. Is that understanding, that concept of hate speech legislation, of something you say that someone else may find hateful, we're not finding that just in terms of Islam, but in terms of the whole trans debate and wider. I'm assuming in the US, it's still just tied to maybe the Islam conversation, or is that a concern that actually this kind of Islamophobia or even transphobia, anything you say that's regarded as hateful by the person, therefore is wrong, is legally wrong, not just in bad taste, but actually is legally wrong? I mean, how far is that spread across the US, where you have full free speech, really, with the First Amendment?
So the issue is, in a way, less legislation than the actual signals that are being sent to police, to judges, to the various bodies that actually end up enforcing it. So in the United States, pretty much anything short of shouting a bomb threat is legally protected speech, legally. Of course, the actual implementation is another matter. Thus, you actually end up with people being, in the UK, people are being arrested despite the fact that it is a very selective arrest. There was a gentleman that went to anti-Israel rally, and he had a sign that condemned Israel, and he condemned Hamas, and he was arrested for the Hamas sign, not the Israel sign. The subtext here is that the police have gotten marching orders. They clearly understand what their job is, not whatever the legislation tells them. And that's the real problem, because, Legislation is a piece of paper. It may be a very significant paper. We like to think of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the government show, not actually in any way interfere with any kind of speech, to be a pretty significant piece of paper. But the bottom line is it's a piece of paper until it's actually acted upon. And you have a situation where the police forces are very clearly told this is what you do, and protesting to them about the actual law makes no difference. During the pandemic, we've had plenty of times where people were treated in an unconstitutional manner, and people can argue the Constitution, but the police would still arrest you. Now, in the long term, the law means that if you pursue this long enough, then perhaps you will endure. You will be found innocent, and 4 years later, and countless hundreds of thousands of dollars or pounds later, perhaps you will be a champion or a martyr. But it's not actually a good bargain for the vast majority of the population, which means that 99% of the population will also receive the signal, and they will understand that certain things you do not say because there will be punishment. So the first tier is cancel culture, where you can be fired, you can have your life destroyed, of everything short of actual legal action. The second tier is legal action, where the police understand that, yes, in theory, whatever the law says doesn't really matter because they've gotten their marching orders from the people above them saying, these are the people you need to round up. And that is actually how policing works. It's not about the law. Very few policemen are conversant with the law. What they are conversant with is the priorities of their superiors. And the priorities of their superiors in the UK and parts of the US, unfortunately, are to repress any kind of political opposition to the agendas of the left and their allies like Islam.
No, absolutely. And whenever a US police force has Arabic on their on their logo, it certainly raises alarm bells. But demographics is another issue in terms of this. And in the UK Parliament, we have 20 Muslim MPs, which kind of fits with the percentage, I think, of Muslims in the UK. But I think the UK Parliament has more Muslim MPs than any other parliament in Europe. So we are leading the way in that. But with
Quite an
Mahmood,
honor.
I know, but with Mahmood, obviously, when she was elected in 2010, she was one of 3 female Muslim MPs, the first. When she was re-elected in 2015, she had 73% of the vote. I thought you only got such a vote share in North Korea, but anyway, she got 73%. And then I delved into that area, her constituency, her voting area, and it's 53% Muslim. And we are seeing these changes, these demographic changes in many areas. I think we have around 15 local authorities that are majority Muslim, and it's fast spreading in terms of the Muslim population going up 10 times faster than the national population. I mean, how do you view those figures as an American, and how does that concern translate into what is happening in the US?
If anything, people are too optimistic about demographics. They focus on the overall demographic picture and they say, let's say there are only 5% Muslims in this area, or 3%. In New York City, for example, there are supposedly 3%. We don't have really reliable statistics on it, but let's say it's 3%. So it's not really 3%, because the demographic picture you really want to look at are the younger population. And the younger population in the UK and the US, the statistical breakdown is much higher than the overall population, because we have the older generation that has longer lifespans, and they form a sizable percentage of the picture. So you have the older generations themselves are kind of more, so we say indigenous population, members of the indigenous population. And then you have the members of the new coming immigrant Muslim population. And under 20, they actually start forming a majority very, very quickly. Under 10, you actually see them taking over entire schools. And if you look at baby names, well, you see baby names, Muhammad forming as the top baby name all across major cities in Europe. And that just means that they're now actually a majority of the births in many cases, which means at that point they are effectively a future demographic majority, unless something is very, very urgently done about that. So a few years ago, and I was tracking this, Muhammad actually popped into the top 10 baby names in New York City. At that point, I knew we had trouble ahead. So I could have predicted the rise of Zoran Mamdani at that point. And it's also instructive when it comes to elections. Thus, for example, yes, it's about 3% of the Muslim population in New York City. The problem is that in the key primary in New York City is a Democratic town, which means it's a two-party system. There's really one. I mean, there's like 20 parties, but none of those actually matter. It's effectively a two-party system. So, and the Democrats have a lock on the city. So what mattered really was that one primary. And in that primary, about 5% of New Yorkers voted. So they only needed another 2% to get Mamdani over the top as far as that was concerned. And they had the block vote. There's a large Bangladeshi Pakistani community that formed in New York City. They actually now control a number of areas in Queens, which may be obscure to most British listeners, but that's actually the area where President Trump came from. It's where he was born. It used to be a working class area of New York. You know, when you look at movies that are set in New York City and you have those kinds of working class type salt of the earth people, that was Queens, was parts of Brooklyn. A lot of that is now gone, much as it has in British cities and so many other cities. So those are now populated by Muslims. They elected Mamdani. They've tried to take over a number of other seats there. And the key thing is they have block voting. So Mamdani's big pre-election tour was his big pre-election tour. He went to all the mosques in the city. And there's a few hundred of them now in New York City. So he did a tour of all the mosques, and he said this is going to be an election that will be a chance to prove that non-Muslim belongs in City Hall, and that is exactly what it turned out to be. So when a lot of people don't vote, and this is something we tend to see in block voting areas also, which is why you can end up with maybe a 53% Muslim population, but 73% vote, because a lot of people decide to give up. So in the United States, you have something called gerrymandering, which means they manipulate particular districts, areas, to favor a particular group, which in many cases is a minority group. And at that point, people who are not members of that minority group throw up their hands and say, it doesn't matter, my vote doesn't count. And at that point, those people there are routinely elected by 86%, 96%. It's not even voter fraud. It's just that most people have just abandoned hope. They don't see a point in voting. And at that point, you just really have areas that are controlled by a particular group, and that group, of course, uses that to expand, to make the leap to higher office. And if too few people participate, in local primaries, well, you end up with Mamdani. And, you know, even with only a 3% Muslim population, they can still take a mayoral election from the other 97%.
We know the term gerrymandering well here, Daniel. Don't worry. It's a term that we see in the UK and across Europe. But you mentioned the name, and I saw the post you put up a few days ago on Muhammad as a baby name, kind of rising in the rankings of New York. We've had Muhammad being, well, I think officially for the last 3 years in the UK. I think we're the only European country that has it number one, not even France. They've kind of kept French names. We've abandoned that. But then if you look further back, you realize there are so many variations of the name Muhammad. If you put those together, the number one has been there for years before. The UK media, they've reported on that each year and highlighted that so the public can see that. I don't think they've connected that with the change of society, the change of culture, the change of direction in the UK. I don't know whether many Americans are aware of the rise of the name in New York. I think maybe they just see this as a Michigan problem.
Unfortunately, it's not just a Michigan problem. We've had refugee resettlement in this country that has seeded large Muslim populations across the country in unexpected places like Maine. And again, as mentioned, you can actually have a fairly small percentage and they can actually leapfrog their way to higher office. For example, the Georgia State Senate, that's a local legislative body. The Muslim population of the state is fairly small, but they make up 10% of the Democratic state Senate delegation. It's an example of how they can very effectively utilize block voting to leapfrog. And they've dug themselves deep into the left. The left decided that they are the top minority group with the possible exception of transgenders, and thus elevating them as an urgent issue. All the current Gaza fighting, of course, also makes it that much urgent to bring them up to higher level political office because that has become the primary issue for a lot of people on the left. So apart from transgenders, they are really dominating in a lot of political offices. They're emerging out of local political offices. Then they can make the jump to national offices, to state level offices, to national level offices. You mentioned, at the beginning of the show that the United States is still far behind the UK. Sadly not. I estimated at about 15 years. So we are where you were about 15 years ago, and it's a canary in the coal mine there.
Well, our prayers and Godspeed to America to change course before it's too late, as it is in many parts of Europe, certainly the UK and France and Belgium and Sweden. We have seen huge changes in the society. Where does this? I mean, the awareness of politicians for this. If you look at New York, to think you've gone from Giuliani to possibly Maimondi. I mean, you kind of think how that has happened. Is it because politicians have been asleep? I mean, you see, if you look at parts of the UK, you go to the northern parts of England, used to be a church on every corner, now there's a mosque on every corner, and whole societies are completely changed. I don't know whether that same visual awareness is there for those in the US or if it's happened quieter and therefore people have not become aware. But sorry, for New York, how have you gone from Giuliani to where you are at the moment?
And a similar phenomenon may have actually taken place in London, a lot of major Western cities. The middle class, the working class effectively disappeared. They've been squeezed out. What you have is a very wealthy upper class, and that tends to be on the left. And you also have the what I call the welfare class, which are people who get government subsidies for a living. A whole lot of new immigrants who have arrived and displaced the population. They're the only ones willing to live in deeply troubled areas, and that's really what New York City looks like. There's a top layer, there's a bottom layer, there's not much of a middle layer, certainly not much of a traditionally American middle level layer. And of course, there's also the disappearance of the churches because there's a disappearance of Christianity. Um, you look at the rates among the younger population of those who believe, and the none of the above, the people who are unaffiliated religiously, tend to be very, very high on the list. The organized religion has very much failed. Organized Christian religion has failed. Judaism, to some extent, to pass that on. You have a population of young, upwardly mobile hipsters, people with money, but people really with no sense of roots, no sense of the significance of the past, and no sense of religious tradition or identity. And so, yes, the churches are closing. They're being replaced by mosques because the Muslim world has done a much better job of transmitting their religious ideals and their religious agenda to the next generation, in part because they have a compelling narrative. Their narrative is, we are conquering the entire world. You know, what does Christianity and Judaism have to compete with that? In the past, there were spiritual values. There was the conviction that what we did had meaning and purpose. And a lot of the developments, that would be an hour lecture in and of itself, have knocked that under, convinced people that there's really no meaning and purpose to life. There's no order. The universe is just random. We live, we die. In between, things happen. There's no actual mission to life. You ask young people, what's your mission? Maybe save the planet, save the whales. But no, we're really destroying the planet. The planet would be better off without us. If you believe that, then really what you're not going to bother with organized religion.
Can I finish off on just something could be different? A spotlight on the David Horowitz Freedom Center. We had David on. It was donkeys ago, maybe 3 years ago, and with his passing in April, you've stepped into that role and you fill big shoes. And certainly, I'd encourage the listeners and viewers to pray for you and taking up that role, and that you have the wisdom and the ability to actually continue to grow that entity, which David did so well. But maybe give us, as we close, a little snapshot on the David Horowitz Freedom Center. How can people get involved, and kind of what your thoughts and vision is for the future?
David Horowitz was a young militant leftist a long time ago. He actually spent quite a bit of time in the UK, actually working with leftist organizations back in the day, Isaac Deutscher. And he came back to the US. He organized every possible radical leftist movement. And then he had a wake-up call. He had a wake-up call that the left was fundamentally evil, that was profoundly destructive, and that it needed to be defeated. And with the Reagan years, he spent the remainder of his life, which was quite significant, actually, teaching people, ordinary people, to wake up and how to fight the left. And that is still our mission today. We're spreading awareness. We're saying all the things that cannot be said. One of David's most winning and most infuriating qualities was he said the things that you were not allowed to say. And granted, in the United States, not being allowed to say it meant social sanction. It didn't mean a prison sentence back then, and still today for now. But nonetheless, that is still something that we do. We tackle the truth in very uncompromising ways. One of the reasons we can do that is because, again, we still have enough freedom of speech that I can say things about the British government, and it's collaboration with Islam that would get me arrested if I were there. I've been a bit discreet on the podcast to, avoid any entanglements. But one of the things we actually appreciate is that we can actually help people in the UK. We can help people in Europe. We actually publish a number of European writers because, once again, we can actually fight the fight that some people can't fight over there, and that's what we do. We see this as a global battle, as a national battle, as a civilizational war.
Oh, it really is, and Godspeed to you as you continue to build the organization. Daniel, I really appreciate you coming on. As I said at the beginning, followed your work, and you're a fearless commentator on a range of issues, focusing on Islam and the left. And I'm delighted that I should have reached out to you earlier, but I'm delighted that you had the time to join us today and share your thoughts, certainly on, and intriguing, I think, from a UK perspective, having a US citizen actually talking about the UK issue and shining a light on that. So thank you so much for giving us your time today.
It's been a great honor and a pleasure. Thank you.